Welcome back. We're doing really well. What remains is letting NASA abort missions that will need to be rescheduled. Maybe it's our rocket that has an engineering issue that urgently needs to be fixed. Or maybe there's some very rough weather that's been forecast on our launch date. What we can safely guess is that when we click this red X, the abort launch endpoint in our API will be called. Most likely, we'll be identifying our missions by this flight number, which is a number that's unique to each of our flights. We can then use this flight number as an ID to query for a specific item in our launches collection. Now, because we're aborting a mission, it's worth thinking which HTTP verb we're going to use for our abort endpoint. For example, we could use the put method to update a launch to say that it's been aborted. That would be a valid approach, but the operation that's closest to aborting a launch would probably be the delete operation from our create, read, update, and delete, from those CRUD operations. So let's go with that. Our delete operation will return 200 OK if it was successful, and 404 not found if the ID of the flight we're trying to abort was not found. Let's explore how we might build this delete endpoint from the top down. Starting from the functionality that's closest to the user and our front-end dashboard, going down into the implementation on the server side. Just like the bottom-up approach, this is also valid. So let's get a feel for doing this top-down. In our client, we'll start by looking at what happens when we click that X to abort the launch. What's going to happen is on our upcoming page, somewhere here we'll call a function when that X is clicked. Right here we have the table of upcoming launches, and for each link, we have this onClick handler that calls abort launch, passing in the launch flight number. This abort launch function is coming in to our component from this hooks file under use launches. Right here underneath where we do the submit launch. And what happens in our abort launch is that we call our HTTP abort launch function, which we already know is going to be in our requests.js file and empty, telling us that we need to fill it in with our call to the API when we want to delete a launch with some given ID, which is passed in as an argument. Let's see if we can fill this in before writing the actual API. Let me clean up the comments. And in our function, we already know from our previous functions that we're going to want to return the awaited result of our fetch function, fetching our API underscore URL, and this time we're talking to the launches collection. But here's where it gets interesting. We query that collection by passing in this ID for our launch, for the flight number that we want to abort. So I'll pass that in as a template string. And remember, our fetch function is a get unless we specify a different HTTP method by passing in this method parameter in the options object, saying that it's a delete operation. Now, let's look at how our function is being used. In use launches, we can see that the response from our function is being used to set this success variable that determines whether we need to refresh our launches if it was a success, and what sound to play depending on what happened. So just like in our submit launch case, we'll want to catch our errors. For example, if our internet connection is unreliable, or the server rejects our request because of CORS, and we'll do this try-catch handling just like we did before, so that in our use launches file, we can just set the success to response.ok. Remember, we don't want our fetch call to have different behavior if the server responds with a 400 response, which would set this response.ok to false, versus when the network is down, and this response.ok would normally not be set because an error is thrown. So we'll try this fetch function and catch errors, which we can log, but we then want to return this object with the OK property set to false. We now have a clear path forward to making this work in our server. Let's build out the corresponding route in our launches collection under launches.router.js. Our third endpoint here is going to be launchesrouter.delete, and we're going to pass in slash because we're at the root of the launches collection. But this time, we're going to use Express's parameter syntax to say that we pass in a parameter called ID, which we have access to in our route handler, which we'll call HTTP abort launch. That's going to come in from our launches controller right here next to our router. We can add our abort launch function. So function HTTP abort launch, which takes in a request and a response, which we know, of course, we have to export from our module. First thing, we need to get that launch ID, which is passed in as a parameter to our route. So let's say const launch ID equals, and remember how we get our request parameters? It's request.params, and then the name that we put in our route. So in this case, :ID means that we can call in our controller request.params.id. Now, our controller needs to make use of our launches model to abort a launch. Let's think about this for a second. We have this map where we can look up flights by flight number, and our controller will need to check whether that launch exists, returning 404 not found. So if launch doesn't exist, return response.status 404, and we can tell the user in our JSON object that the error message is launch not found. Whereas if the launch does exist, we'll want to return our successful status code, so 200, and in the body, we'll pass in the object that we just deleted or aborted. So our user at NASA knows that they aborted the correct launch. Now, we could separate this into two separate operations in our model. We could look up whether the launch exists, and if that returns false, we would return this error, and then we could delete our launch as the second step using a separate function in our model. Or we could try doing both of these operations in one model function. Let's take a look at the first possibility. In our launches model, we'll create a function right above getAllLaunches that says function exists launch with ID, and we're passed in a launch ID where we just return from our launches map whether that map has an element with the key matching that launch ID, where the launch ID is actually the flight number. So in our controller, we could say first importing our function, which we called exists launch with ID, that lives in our model, and we'll call that to check if our launch exists. So if exists launch with ID launch ID, and we're checking actually if a launch with that ID doesn't exist. So if not exists launch with ID, return launch not found. And then how do we abort our launch? Well, let's create a function right here at the bottom of our file. Function abort launch by ID. And again, we pass in a launch ID, and we do something in this function. First, let's make sure that we're exporting exists launch with ID and our abort function. There we go. Now, we're not done yet. Our code probably still has a few issues, but this video is getting a little bit long. So let's take a minute break, stretch, and get right back into that abort function. We're just getting to the good part, and we're going to discuss some interesting things when it comes to designing models. So I'll see you really soon.